An act of kindness should never cost a woman her entire world. For Abigail, Rose living a solitary life in the barren Arizona desert, offering a cup of water to a dying stranger, was a simple matter of humanity. But this single act ignites a firestorm of passion, deceit, and revenge. The man she saves, a mysterious drifter named Cassian, promises to repay her by writing her name in the stars. But as their destinies collide, a dark conspiracy surfaces, proving that in a land of dust and dreams, the most dangerous secrets are not buried in the ground, but in the hearts of men. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Gila Desert in the summer of 1883. It beat down on the parched earth, cracking it into a mosaic of suffering. From her small, isolated homestead, Abigail Rose watched the heat haze shimmer, blurring the line between the sky and the sand. The world outside her window was a canvas of ochre rust and the pale, unforgiving blue of the sky. It had been 2 years since her husband, Thomas, had succumbed to a rattlesnake bite, leaving her alone to wrestle a living from the stubborn land. Her days were a routine of survival, a quiet battle against the elements. She tended to her small flock of goats, coaxed meager vegetables from her garden, and spent her evenings by candlelight mending clothes and reading the one book she owned, a worn copy of Moby Dick. The isolation was a double-edged sword. It was a shield from the world's harshness, but also a cage that amplified her loneliness. The nearest town, dusty and grim, was a full day's ride away, and she made the journey only when absolutely necessary. One sweltering afternoon, as she drew water from the well, her most prized possession, she saw it. A dark shape on the horizon, slowly resolving itself into the figure of a man stumbling through the shimmering heat. He was on foot, a death sentence in this part of the country. He moved with the lurching gait of a man at the end of his rope, his silhouette a stark black slash against the fiery backdrop of the desert. Caution, a lesson, etched into the heart of every settler, screamed at her to bolt the door and load the Winchester that leaned against the wall. A lone woman was a vulnerable target, but another instinct, one she inherited from a mother who believed kindness was a currency more valuable than gold, warred with her fear. The man was dying. She could see it even from this distance. She hesitated for only a moment longer before making her decision. Leaving the bucket by the well, she filled a large tin cup with the cool, precious water. She unlatched the gate of her small, fenced-in yard and walked out to meet him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As she drew closer, his condition became horrifyingly clear. His clothes were rags caked with dust and what looked like dried blood. His face beneath a layer of grime and a scruffy dark beard was a mask of torment. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes sunken into bruised-looking hollows. He was tall, with a broad-shouldered frame that spoke of a strength now leached away by the sun. He didn't seem to see her until she was just a few feet away. He stopped swaying on his feet, and his eyes a startling intense shade of blue, like the heart of a winter flame focused on her. They held a flicker of disbelief, as if he thought she was another mirage sent to mock his final moments. "What Abigail's voice was a little more than a croak roar from disuse. He didn't answer. He simply stared at the cup in her hand, his gaze so desperate it was a physical force. She took the final steps toward him and held it out. His hand, when he reached for it, was trembling violently. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against hers as he took the cup. He drank with a raw, guttural urgency, the water spilling down his chin and chest, leaving dark streaks in the dust. He emptied it in seconds, and his gaze lifted to hers again, a silent, desperate plea for more. Abigail took the cup back and returned to the well. Her earlier fear replaced by a wave of pity, so profound it made her ache. She refilled the cup and brought it to him. This time he drank more slowly, his body seeming to absorb the life-giving liquid. When he finished, a long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. "Thank you." He rasped, his voice a dry, gravelly whisper. He tried to hand the cup back, but his strength failed him. He crumpled to the ground unconscious before he hit the cracked earth. For a moment, Abigail stared down at him, a fresh wave of panic washing over her. What had she done? She had invited a danger she couldn't possibly handle. He was a stranger, a man without a horse, a name, or a past. But looking at his gaunt face, peaceful in its sudden oblivion, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. With a strength born of necessity, she looped her arms under his shoulders and began to drag him. He was heavy, a dead weight, and the short distance back to her homestead was a monumental struggle. She grunted and strained her muscles, screaming in protest, her boots kicking up clouds of fine red dust. She managed to pull him into the shade of the small porch, his head lolling against the wooden planks. She fetched a blanket and a pillow, making him as comfortable as she could. She cleaned his face with a damp cloth, gently wiping away the layers of grime. Underneath his features were strong and angular, with a square jaw and a straight nose. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps in his early 30s. There were lines of hardship etched around his eyes and mouth, but there was an underlying handsomeness to him that was hard to ignore. She also found the source of the blood, a nasty, but not life-threatening gash on his forearm, which she cleaned and bandaged with a strip of clean linen. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, the man stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, and those intense blue eyes fixed on her once more. This time they were clearer, the haze of delirium replaced by a dawning awareness. "Where?" he started, his voice still rough. "My home," Abigail said softly, kneeling beside him. "You collapsed. I brought you here." He pushed himself up, wincing as he moved. "I'm indebted to you, ma'am." "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "Anyone would have done the same." He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "No, ma'am. They wouldn't have." He looked around, taking in the small, tidy homestead, the setting sun, and the vast, empty desert beyond. "You're a long way from anywhere." "That's the way I like it," she said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "I'm Cassian," he said, extending his hand. His grip was weak, but his handshake was firm. Abigail rose. "Abigail." He repeated the name, a soft murmur on his lips. He looked up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to prick through the deepening twilight. A beautiful name. Abigail felt a blush creep up her neck, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the day's heat. She stood up, suddenly, flustered. "Are you hungry? I have some stew." "I'd be grateful," he said, his eyes still on the heavens. She brought him a bowl of venison stew and a piece of cornbread. He ate like a man starved, but with a surprising gentility, as if he were fighting a lifetime of hunger. When he was finished, he leaned his head back against the wall of the house and closed his eyes. "You saved my life, Abigail Rose," he said, his voice stronger now. "I have nothing to offer you in return. No money, no horse, Nothing but my thanks." "Your thanks are enough," she said, sitting in her rocking chair a few feet away, the Winchester now resting within arm's reach. The desert night was descending, bringing with it a deceptive coolness and a chorus of cicadas. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the chirping of the insects and the gentle creak of her chair. Abigail watched him, her curiosity warring with her ingrained caution. Who was this man, Cassian? Where had he come from, and where was he going? He was a mystery, a stone dropped into the placid pool of her solitary existence. As the sky turned from deep indigo to velvety black, a breathtaking canopy of stars emerged. In the clear, dry air of the desert, they blazed with a brilliance she had never seen in the cities of the East. Cassian opened his eyes and gazed up at the celestial display. A strange, almost reverent expression came over his face. "I used to be an astronomer," he said, his voice soft with memory. "Back east. A lifetime ago." Abigail was taken aback. This rugged, half-starved man seemed a world away from the learned, scholarly image of an astronomer. "What happened?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the river of stars that flowed across the sky. "Life," he said finally, a world of pain and regret in that single word. He pointed a long finger towards a bright constellation. "Do you know what that is?" Abigail shook her head. "I'm afraid my knowledge of the stars doesn't extend much beyond the North Star." "That's Cygnus the Swan," he said, his voice taking on a new energy, a passion that was startling in its intensity. He began to trace the patterns in the sky, naming the constellations with a familiar ease. Lyra, Aquila, Hercules. He spoke of nebulae and distant galaxies of the vast, silent dance of the cosmos. He spoke of them not as a scientist, but as a poet, his words painting vivid pictures in the darkness. Abigail listened, mesmerized. In his voice, the stars were not just cold, distant points of light, but living, breathing entities, each with its own story, its own soul. He was a man of contradictions, a drifter with the knowledge of a scholar, a survivor with the soul of a dreamer. Then he did something that made her breath catch in her throat. He pointed to a small, seemingly empty patch of sky, a dark space between two brilliant constellations. And there he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "Right there. That's Abigail's Crossing." She stared at him confused. "What are you talking about?" "There's nothing there." "Not yet," he said, turning his head to look at her. In the starlight, his blue eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. "But there will be. A new constellation, a testament to the woman who showed kindness to a stranger in the desert. I'll write your name in the stars. Abigail Rose. It's the only payment I can offer." A shiver ran down Abigail's spine, a strange mix of fear and an emotion she couldn't name. The man was delirious, surely. And yet there was a conviction in his voice, a sincerity in his gaze that was utterly compelling. For the first time in a long time, the vast, empty desert didn't feel so lonely. It felt watched by a million silent, blazing eyes, and by the intense, unsettling gaze of the man who called himself Cassian, the man who had promised to write her name in the stars. She didn't know it then, but in saving his life she had set in motion a chain of events that would shatter her solitude and rewrite her destiny, not in the stars, but in the blood and dust of the unforgiving West. Cassian stayed. Abigail didn't ask him to, nor did she ask him to leave. It was an unspoken arrangement, a silent acknowledgement of their shared solitude in the vast emptiness. He was a man with nowhere to go, and she was a woman with no one to share her world with. He was weak still, recovering from his ordeal in the desert, and for the first few days he did little more than rest in the shade of the porch, his gaze often drifting to the sky, as if searching for an answer in the clouds. Abigail found herself falling into a new routine, one that included a second plate at her small table, a quiet presence in the chair opposite her. She learned more about him in small, fragmented pieces. He spoke of his childhood in Philadelphia, of a father who was a watchmaker and a mother who loved to read. He spoke of his studies at the university, of his passion for the celestial bodies. But of the years between then and now he remained silent. A dark curtain hung over that part of his life, and Abigail, sensing the pain that lay behind it, did not press. In return, she found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone since Thomas's death. She spoke of her own dreams of the life she had imagined before the harsh realities of the West had whittled them down to the simple goal of survival. She spoke of her love for the land, its stark beauty, and its unforgiving nature. Cassian was a good listener. His intense blue eyes fixed on her as she spoke, making her feel as if her words were the most important thing in the world. As his strength returned, Cassian began to make himself useful. He was surprisingly skilled with his hands. He repaired the broken hinge on her barn door, reinforced the fence of her goat pen, and even managed to fix the old water pump that had been sitting idle for a year. He worked with a quiet efficiency, a focused intensity that she found herself admiring. He was a man of purpose, even in the small, mundane tasks of her daily life. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of work, they sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the sky. "You should have let me die out there, Abigail," Cassian said, his voice low. Abigail stopped her rocking chair. "Don't say that." "It's true," he said, not looking at her. "I was running from something that's going to find me sooner or later, and when it does, it's going to bring a storm of trouble to your doorstep." "What are you running from?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the chirping of the crickets. "A man," he said finally. "A man named Jedediah Cain." The name meant nothing to Abigail, but the way Cassian said it sent a chill down her spine. It was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and a deep, simmering hatred. "He was my partner," Cassian continued, his voice tight with a barely controlled rage. "We were prospectors. We struck a vein of silver in the mountains of Colorado, more than we could have ever dreamed of." He paused, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "It was supposed to be our new beginning, a chance to escape our pasts and build a new life. But for Jedediah, it wasn't enough. He wanted it all." Abigail listened, her hands clenched in her lap. The story was a familiar one in the West, a tale of greed and betrayal as old as the hills. "He tried to kill me," Cassian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Left me for dead in a collapsed mine shaft. I was trapped for 3 days. I don't know how I survived. When I finally dug myself out, he was gone. And so was the silver." "You went to the law?" Abigail asked. Cassian shook his head. "Jedediah is the law in those parts. He bought himself a town, a sheriff, a judge, everything. He's a man who gets what he wants, and he wants me dead. He knows I'm the only one who can prove he's a fraud and a murderer." "So you ran?" Abigail said. "I ran," he confirmed, "and I've been running ever since, for 3 years. He's relentless, Abigail. He has men everywhere. Sooner or later, one of them will find me." He turned to her. Then his blue eyes filled with a desperate intensity. "You need to tell me to leave, for your own safety." Abigail looked at him, at the raw pain in his eyes, at the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. She saw the man he was not, the trouble he might bring. "And where would you go?" she asked softly. He had no answer. He simply stared out at the darkening desert, a man adrift in a sea of his own making. "You'll be safe here," Abigail said, her voice firm, with a conviction that surprised even herself. "No one will find you here." A flicker of something gratitude, relief, perhaps even hope crossed his face. "You're a fool, Abigail Rose," he said. But there was no malice in his words. "Perhaps," she replied, a small smile touching her lips, "but I'm a fool who knows how to use a Winchester." The days that followed were a strange, idyllic interlude. The threat of Jedediah Cain was a distant storm cloud on the horizon, a future problem that seemed less real in the face of the peaceful present. Cassian's presence transformed the homestead. The silence was no longer heavy with loneliness, but filled with the comfortable quiet of companionship. They worked together during the day, their hands often brushing as they passed tools or buckets of water. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, and Cassian would resume his celestial lessons, pointing out constellations and telling her the ancient stories behind them. He had a way of speaking that made the vast impersonal universe feel intimate and full of wonder. One night, he brought out a long brass telescope. It was old and battered, but the lenses were clean and well cared for. "My father's," he explained, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "It's the only thing I have left of him." He set it up on the porch and aimed it at the moon, which hung like a silver coin in the black sky. He beckoned her over. "Look," he said. Abigail peered through the eyepiece, and her breath caught in her throat. The moon was no longer a flat, distant object, but a world of breathtaking detail. She could see the craters, the mountains, the vast, dark seas. It was a landscape of stark, silent beauty. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eye still pressed to the lens. "Not as beautiful as the woman looking at it," Cassian said, his voice a low murmur beside her. Abigail straightened up, her heart pounding. She turned to face him, and in the soft glow of the moonlight, his face was close to hers. His blue eyes were searching hers, and she saw in them a reflection of the same longing that she felt in her own heart. The air between them was electric, charged with unspoken words and a powerful magnetic pull. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. She stood her ground, her gaze locked with his. When his lips met hers, it was with a gentleness that belied the rugged exterior of the man. The kiss was tentative at first, a question asked and answered. Then, as the pent-up emotions of the past weeks came flooding to the surface, it deepened, becoming a desperate, passionate expression of a shared loneliness, a shared hope. In that moment, under the watchful eyes of 1,000,000 stars, Abigail Rose felt a sense of completeness she hadn't known was possible. The hole in her heart, the one left by Thomas's death, was suddenly filled. It was a dangerous, reckless feeling, a happiness so fragile it felt like a dream. But it was a dream she was not yet ready to wake from. The next morning, however, the dream was shattered. A cloud of dust on the horizon, larger than any she had ever seen before, signaled the approach of riders. Not one or two, but a group of them. They were moving fast with a purpose that made Abigail's blood run cold. Cassian saw it too. He was standing by the well, his face a grim, stony mask. "He's found me," he said, his voice flat and devoid of hope. "We don't know that," Abigail said, trying to sound brave, though her hands were trembling. "It could be anyone." "It's him," Cassian said, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. "I know it." The riders were closer now, close enough for Abigail to see that they were armed. They were a rough-looking group, their faces hard and weathered, their eyes cold and merciless. They were not friendly travelers. They were hunters, and Cassian was their prey. "Get inside, Abigail," Cassian said, his voice urgent. "Bolt the door and don't come out no matter what you hear." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her hand reaching for the Winchester that was leaning against the porch railing. "Don't be a fool," he hissed, his eyes blazing with a fierce protective light. "This is my fight, not yours." But it was her fight now. She had made it her fight the moment she had given him a cup of water, the moment she had let him into her home, the moment she had let him into her heart. The riders were almost upon them, their horses thundering across the dry earth. The man in the lead, a large, bull-necked man with a cruel, sneering face, reined in his horse and spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Well, well," he said, his eyes locking onto Cassian. "Look what the cat dragged in. We've been looking for you, Professor." He turned his mocking gaze on Abigail. "And who's this pretty little thing?" "You find yourself a new partner, Cassian. I hope she's more loyal than the last one." The man's laughter was a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the sudden silence. The other riders joined in their laughter, a chorus of cruel mockery. Cassian stepped forward, placing himself between Abigail and the riders. "This has nothing to do with her, Flint," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Your business is with me." "Oh, I know," Flint said, his smile widening. "But Mr. Kane, he's a thorough man. He wants all loose ends tied up. And this little lady—" He gestured towards Abigail with his riding crop. "She looks like a very loose end." The threat was unmistakable. Abigail's grip on the Winchester tightened, her knuckles turning white. The world had shrunk to this small patch of desert, to the space between her and the men who had come to destroy her newfound happiness. The storm Cassian had warned her about had arrived, and it was far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The standoff was a taut wire of tension stretched to the breaking point. Flint's men, a pack of wolves circling their prey, had fanned out their hands, hovering over the pistols holstered at their hips. Abigail could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure that was both humiliating and terrifying. "Leave her out of this, Flint." Cassian repeated, his voice a low growl. "I'll go with you." "No trouble." Flint chuckled, a nasty rumbling sound. "You think you're in a position to make bargains?" Professor Mr. Kane was very specific. "No witnesses, no attachments." His eyes, small and dark like a pig's, roamed over Abigail again, lingering on her face, her form in a way that made her skin crawl. Besides, he added a lecherous grin, spreading across his face. "It's a long, lonely ride back to Colorado. A little female company might make the journey more pleasant." A murderous rage, cold and pure, flashed in Cassian's eyes. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, but Flint was ready for him, in a movement almost too fast to see. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked, a deafening sound in the silence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Flint said, the smile never leaving his face. "I'm a patient man, but my trigger finger, it gets a little itchy in the heat." Abigail's heart was a wild bird trapped in her ribs. She had the Winchester, and she was a good shot. She could probably take Flint out before he even knew what was happening. But what about the others? There were 5 of them, all armed, all watching her with the cold, dispassionate eyes of predators. She would be dead before she could fire a second shot. And Cassian would be dead with her. It was a hopeless situation, a dead end. But as she looked at Cassian, standing tall and defiant in the face of certain death, a desperate, reckless idea began to form in her mind. It was a gamble, a long shot, but it was the only card
she had left to play. "Wait," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She stepped forward out from behind the partial cover of the porch post, the Winchester held loosely in her hands. Flint's attention shifted to her, his eyebrows raising in amusement.
"Well, the little bird wants to sing." "What is it, darling? You want to plead for your man's life?" "It's a little late for that." "He's not my man," Abigail said, forcing a coldness into her voice that she did not feel. She looked at Cassian, her expression a mask of indifference. "He's a drifter, a liar. He showed up at my door, half dead, and I took pity on him. That was my mistake." She saw the flicker of hurt in Cassian's eyes, a wound far deeper than any bullet could inflict. It nearly broke her resolve, but she held on, clinging to the desperate hope that this charade might save them both. "He told me stories," she continued, her voice dripping with a manufactured scorn. "About a silver mine, about a partner who betrayed him. I didn't believe a word of it. I was just about to run him off my land when you gentlemen arrived." Flint's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He looked from Abigail to Cassian, then back again. "Is that so?" "It is," Abigail said, her gaze unwavering. But then he mentioned a name. A Mr. Jedediah Kane. He said this Mr. Kane was a very wealthy man, a very powerful man. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Now a man like that, he must have enemies, and he must be willing to pay well for information about them. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. The leering mockery in Flint's eyes was replaced by a shrewd, calculating glint. Greed was a language these men understood far better than threats or violence. "What kind of information?" Flint asked, his voice now a low, conspiratorial murmur. "This man," Abigail said, gesturing towards Cassian, with the barrel of her Winchester. "He's not just a drifter. He's a smart man, an educated man. He knows things. Things about the stars, about numbers, about business." She was improvising, weaving a story from the threads of truth Cassian had given her. "He told me he had a plan, a way to get back at Mr. Kane, to ruin him." Cassian was staring at her, his face a mixture of confusion and a dawning, horrified understanding. He opened his mouth to speak, but Abigail shot him a look, a silent, desperate plea for him to play along. Flint was hooked. She could see it in the way he leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "What kind of plan?" "I don't know the details," Abigail said, feigning ignorance. He was very secretive. "But I know it involved Mr. Kane's business dealings, his investments. He said he had proof of irregularities, things that would attract the attention of the federal government. It was a wild, desperate bluff, but it was grounded in a truth she knew to be universal. Powerful men often built their empires on foundations of corruption." Flint was silent for a long moment, chewing on her words as he chewed on his tobacco. The other riders were watching him, waiting for their cue. "And why would you be telling me this?" Flint asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Because I'm a businesswoman," Abigail said, her voice hard as steel. "This man is worthless to me dead. But the information in his head, that's valuable, and I'm willing to sell it. A slow, appreciative smile spread across Flint's face. He understood this. This was a transaction, a bargain. How much? $10,000, Abigail said the number so audacious it almost made her choke. In gold. The riders behind Flint murmured amongst themselves. $10,000 was a fortune, more than any of them would see in a lifetime of honest work. Flint laughed, a genuine, booming laugh this time. You've got guts, little lady. I'll give you that. But Mr. Kane isn't going to pay $10,000 for a ghost story. It's not a ghost story, Abigail said, her voice unwavering. And you won't know until you ask him. Will you? What's a telegram to a man like Mr. Kane? A small price to pay for protecting his empire. She played her final card. And if he says no, well, then you can kill us both. You'll have lost nothing but a little time. Flint considered her proposal, his piggish eyes darting between her and Cassian. He was a man caught between his orders and his own avarice. The promise of a reward, a bonus for his troubles, was a powerful lure. All right, little lady, he said. Finally, a decision made. You've got yourself a deal. We'll take him with us. We'll send a wire to Mr. Kane. If what you say is true, you'll get your money. If not... He drew his finger across his throat in a gesture that needed no explanation. He barked an order to his men. 2 of them dismounted and approached Cassian, who offered no resistance. They bound his hands behind his back and pushed him towards one of the horses. He stumbled, his legs still weak, and for a moment Abigail's resolve wavered. The sight of his defeat, his humiliation, was a physical blow. As they tied him to the saddle, Cassian looked at her. His face was a mask of betrayal. His blue eyes pools of cold, silent fury. He didn't understand her plan. He thought she had sold him out, that she had traded his life for a bag of gold. The pain of that misunderstanding was sharper than any knife. You'll regret this, Abigail, he said, his voice low and venomous. I promise you that. I'm counting on it, she whispered, the words lost in the wind. Flint tipped his hat to her, a gesture of mocking respect. Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am. We'll be in touch. And with that, they were gone. A cloud of dust and the thunder of hooves, their only farewell. Abigail stood there, the Winchester feeling heavy and useless in her hands, until they were nothing but a dark speck on the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to collapse, her legs giving way beneath her. She sank to the ground, the dust rising up around her, and the tears she had been holding back finally came hot and bitter. She had saved Cassian's life, but she had lost him in the process. She had made a deal with the devil, and now she had to find a way to pay the price. The homestead was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence, the silence of a future that had been stolen. As the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the land, Abigail Rose picked herself up. The tears were gone, replaced by a hard resolve. She had made a promise not just to Cassian, but to herself. She had started this, and she would finish it. She went into the house and began to pack. A small bag with some food, a canteen of water, and every last bullet she owned. Then she went to the barn and saddled her horse, a sturdy, reliable mare named Bess. She was not a warrior. She was not a gunslinger. She was a homesteader, a woman who had wanted nothing more than a quiet life. But that life was gone now. As she rode out, leaving behind the only home she had ever known, she looked up at the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear pale and distant. She thought of Cassian's promise to write her name in the stars. It seemed like a cruel joke now, a bitter reminder of a happiness that had been snatched away. But as she urged Bess into a gallop, the horse's hooves eating up the miles of desert, a single defiant thought took root in her mind. He may have promised to write her name in the stars, but she was going to carve his name into the heart of Jedediah Cain's empire, even if it was the last thing she ever did. The night was long and dark, but for the first time in her life, Abigail Rose was not afraid of the shadows. She was the shadow, and she was coming. The journey to redemption. The Colorado town that Jedediah Cain had built with his stolen silver was a descent into a different kind of hell. The desert gave way to jagged mountains that clawed at the sky, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual haze of dust from the mining operations that were the town's lifeblood. The air grew thinner, colder, and carried the acrid smell of coal smoke and greed. Abigail rode with a singular, all-consuming purpose. The memory of Cassian's betrayed face was a spur driving her onward. She pushed herself and Bess to the limits of their endurance, sleeping in short, fitful bursts, her hand never far from the butt of her pistol. She was no longer just Abigail Rose, the quiet homesteader. She was a woman on a mission, fueled by a potent cocktail of guilt rage and a desperate, flickering hope. She arrived in Redemption on a cold, grey morning, the town emerging from the mountain mist like a phantom. It was a place of stark contrasts. The main street was lined with impressive newly built structures, a grand hotel with a gilded sign, a sprawling saloon with stained glass windows, and a bank that looked more like a fortress. But behind this facade of prosperity lay a warren of muddy, squalid streets where the miners lived in cramped, miserable shacks, their faces perpetually smudged with coal dust, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Redemption was not a town, it was a kingdom, and Jedediah Cain was its undisputed king. His name was everywhere on the hotel, the saloon, the general store. His presence was an oppressive weight, a constant reminder of the man who had stolen Cassian's life, and in doing so had shattered hers. Abigail knew that walking into this town was like walking into a lion's den. She needed a plan, a disguise. She sold Bess at the livery stable on the outskirts of town, the pang of loss, a sharp, painful reminder of the home she had left behind. With the money, she bought a simple, modest dress, the kind a respectable widow might wear, and a small, plain bonnet to hide her face. She became Mrs. Clayton, a woman from back east looking for a new start after the tragic death of her husband. Her first stop was the telegraph office. She had to know if Flint had contacted Cain, if her desperate gamble had paid off. The telegraph operator, a wiry, nervous man with ink-stained fingers, looked at her with suspicion when she asked if there had been any messages for a Mr. Flint. "Who's asking?" he demanded, his eyes darting around as if he were afraid of being overheard. A business associate, Abigail said, coolly sliding a silver dollar across the counter. The coin disappeared into the man's pocket with a flick of his wrist. "There was a wire," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Came in 2 days ago. From Arizona. An answer was sent this morning." "What did it say?" Abigail pressed her heart, pounding. The man shook his head. "I don't know. It was in code. Mr. Cain's private code. Of course. A man like Cain would not be foolish enough to conduct his business in plain language. But the fact that he had replied was a good sign. It meant he was interested. It meant Cassian was still alive. for now. Abigail's next challenge was to get close to Kane. She needed to know where they were holding Cassian, and she needed to find the proof he had spoken of the evidence that could bring Kane's empire crashing down. She took a room at the boarding house, a clean, respectable establishment run by a stern-faced but kind-hearted woman named Martha. From her window she had a clear view of the Kane Grand Hotel, the center of Jedediah's web. She spent the next few days observing, listening, gathering information. She learned that Kane was a man of strict routines. He spent his mornings in his office at the bank, his afternoons overseeing the mining operations, and his evenings holding court in the hotel's private dining room. He was always surrounded by a coterie of sycophants and armed guards, a man insulated from the world by a wall of money and fear. Getting to him seemed impossible. But Abigail had an advantage that none of Kane's enemies possessed. She was a woman, and in a town like Redemption, where women were either wives or whores, a respectable, unassuming widow was practically invisible. She found her opportunity in the hotel's restaurant. It was a lavish affair with crystal chandeliers and white linen tablecloths. It was also short-staffed. The manager, a harassed-looking man with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow, was complaining loudly about a waitress who had run off with a traveling salesman. Abigail, dressed in her simple, modest attire, approached him with a demure, downcast expression. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "I couldn't help but overhear. I have experience as a waitress. I am a hard worker and a quick learner." The manager looked her up and down, his eyes lingering for a moment on her face before dismissing her as plain and unthreatening. "Can you start now?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Yes, sir." Abigail said a silent prayer of thanks on her lips. Working at the hotel was a grueling, thankless job, but it gave her what she needed access. She learned the layout of the hotel, the comings and goings of its guests, the routines of its staff, and she saw Jedediah Kane up close. He was a man who wore his wealth like a suit of armor. He was impeccably dressed in expensive tailored suits, a large diamond stickpin in his cravat, his fingers adorned with gold rings. He was handsome in a cruel, predatory way, with cold, calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. He moved with an air of absolute authority, his voice a low, commanding rumble that made people jump to do his bidding. Seeing him, Abigail understood how a man like Cassian, a dreamer and a scholar, could have been so easily broken by him. She served him his meals, her hands steady, her face a mask of polite indifference. He barely glanced at her, dismissing her as just another part of the furniture. But she watched him, listened to the conversations that flowed around him, piecing together the fragments of his empire. She heard whispers of land grabs, of rival prospectors who had mysteriously disappeared, of government officials who were on his payroll. Her search for Cassian, however, proved to be more difficult. He was not in the town jail. She checked, feigning a story about a missing cousin. He was not being held at the hotel. She explored every room, every closet under the guise of her cleaning duties. He was being kept somewhere else, somewhere secret. One evening, as she was clearing the tables in the private dining room after Kane and his associates had left, she found something. A piece of paper fallen to the floor, half hidden under the heavy velvet curtain. It was a note scribbled in a hasty, almost illegible hand. "The package is secure at the old assay office, awaiting your instructions." The note was not signed, but Abigail knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone what package it referred to. The old assay office was a derelict building at the edge of town, abandoned since Kane had built his new state-of-the-art facility. It was a place no one went near, a place where a man could be held without anyone knowing he was there. That night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, Abigail made her way to the assay office. The building was dark and silent, a skeletal silhouette against the star-dusted sky. The front door was padlocked, but she found a broken window at the back just large enough to squeeze through. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The main room was empty save for some broken furniture and scattered papers, but a faint line of light shone from under a door at the far end of the room. Her heart pounding, Abigail crept towards the door. She could hear the low murmur of voices from within. She peered through the keyhole, and her breath caught in her throat. Cassian was there. He was chained to a chair, his face bruised and swollen, his clothes torn. But he was alive. Standing over him were two men, one of whom she recognized as one of Flint's riders. They were playing cards, a bottle of whiskey on the table between them. Relief washed over her, so powerful it almost made her weak. But it was quickly followed by a cold, calculating fury. She had found him. Now she had to get him out. But as she watched, the door to the room opened, and Jedediah Kane walked in. He was holding a leather satchel which he placed on the table with a heavy thud. Any trouble, he asked, his voice calm and businesslike. None, Mr. Kane. One of the guards said. He's been quiet as a church mouse. Kane walked over to Cassian and tilted his head up, examining his bruised face with a dispassionate air. You've been a thorn in my side for a long time, Cassian, he said, his voice soft, almost conversational. But all things must come to an end. He opened the satchel and took out a stack of papers bound with a ribbon. I believe you recognize these, he said, holding them up for Cassian to see. Even from her vantage point, Abigail could see the look of dawning horror on Cassian's face. My father's journals. Cassian whispered, his voice raw with disbelief. How did you get them? I have my ways, Kane said with a smug smile. They make for fascinating reading. Your father was a brilliant man, a visionary. He had theories, ideas, about geology, about mining techniques, years ahead of his time. He paused, his eyes glinting with a malevolent light. It's a pity he had to die before he could put them into practice. The implication was clear, and it hit Abigail with the force of a physical blow. Kane hadn't just stolen Cassian's silver. He had stolen his father's work, his legacy. And he had murdered him for it. You... Cassian choked, his voice thick with rage and grief. You killed him. It was business, Kane said with a shrug. He wouldn't sell. He was a sentimental old fool. He tossed the journals onto the table. But you, Cassian, you're not a fool. You're a pragmatist, a survivor. Just like me. He pulled up a chair and sat down opposite Cassian, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Here's my offer. You're going to help me decipher your father's work. You're going to help me build my empire. And in return, I'll let you live. You'll have wealth, comfort, anything you desire. A gilded cage, perhaps, but a comfortable one. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And what about your little lady friend? The one in Arizona. She has spirit. I like that. You work with me, and I'll send for her. She can share your cage. It's a better life than she could ever dream of. From her hiding place, Abigail felt a surge of nausea. This was Kane's plan. Not just to kill Cassian, but to break him, to own him, to turn him into a tool for his own ambition. And if I refuse, Cassian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Kane's smile vanished. Then I will kill you, he said, his voice as cold as a winter grave. slowly. "And then I will pay a visit to your friend Abigail. I'll tell her you died screaming her name. And I will make her last days on this earth a living hell." The room was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the two men. It was a devil's bargain, a choice between two impossible futures. Abigail knew she had to act. Now. She couldn't let Cassian make this choice. She couldn't let Cain win. She drew her pistol, the cold, hard metal a comforting weight in her hand. She was outnumbered, outgunned. But she had something they didn't. She had the element of surprise, and she had nothing left to lose. She took a deep breath, aimed for the lock on the door, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was an explosion of sound, shattering the night, shattering the silence, shattering everything. The game had changed, and Abigail Rose was no longer just a player. She was the storm. The lock splintered the door, bursting inward with the force of the gunshot. For a frozen second, the four men in the room stared in stunned disbelief. It was all the time Abigail needed. She burst into the room, a wraith of vengeance in a plain widow's dress. Her second shot was aimed not at a man, but at the lantern on the table. The glass shattered, plunging the room into a chaotic, terrifying darkness, broken only by the faint silvery light of the stars filtering through the grimy windows. "Cassian!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. Panic erupted. The two guards, disoriented and blind, started firing wildly into the darkness. A bullet whizzed past Abigail's ear, so close she could feel its heat. She dropped to the floor, crawling frantically in the direction where she had last seen Cassian. "Abigail!" "What in God's name?" Cassian's voice was a mixture of shock and disbelief. "No time." She hissed, her hands finding the rough wood of his chair. "Where are the keys? Cain has them." Amid the chaos, Cain's voice, cold and furious, cut through the din. "Don't just stand there, you fools! Get her!" Abigail could hear them stumbling around in the dark, knocking over furniture, cursing. She had to work fast. Her hands searched frantically for the lock on Cassian's chains, but it was impossible in the darkness. "The journals, Cassian," she whispered urgently. "The table." It was a risk, but she knew, with a sudden, unshakable certainty, that they couldn't leave them behind. They were the proof, the weapon that could destroy Cain. Another shot rang out, and one of the guards cried out in pain, a yelp of surprise more than agony. In the confusion, Cain had shot one of his own men. "Get to the window!" Abigail yelled to Cassian. She scrambled towards the table, her hands sweeping across its surface until she felt the smooth leather of the journals. She clutched them to her chest like a shield. Cain was roaring with fury now, a wounded beast in the darkness. "You won't get away with this! I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth!" "You'll have to find us first," Abigail retorted, her voice filled with a bravado she didn't feel. She could hear Cassian shuffling towards the window, dragging the heavy chair with him. She followed the sound, the journals held tight in one arm, her pistol in the other. She reached the window just as the remaining guard lit a match. In the brief, flickering light, she saw his face, his eyes pintwort with a mixture of fear and rage. She fired and the match went out, the man collapsing with a groan. "Abigail, come on," Cassian urged from outside. She didn't hesitate. She threw the journals out the window and then scrambled through the opening, her dress catching on a shard of broken glass. She landed hard on the ground, outside, the breath knocked out of her. Cassian was there, helping her up, his face a pale oval in the starlight. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We have to go, now!" They ran a desperate, stumbling flight into the darkness. Behind them, They could hear Cain's shouts of rage, followed by the sound of a pistol being fired into the night. But they didn't look back. They plunged into the labyrinth of darkened streets and alleyways, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town where the mountain loomed over them like a sleeping giant. They were safe for the moment, but they were trapped. Cain would have the town sealed by morning. Every road, every pass would be watched. "We have to go up," Cassian said, his breathing ragged. He was still dragging the chair, the chains rattling with every step. "Into the mines. It's the only place he won't think to look." "The mines?" Abigail asked, her voice laced with dread. The thought of being trapped underground in the dark, claustrophobic tunnels filled her with a primal fear. "I know them like the back of my hand," Cassian said, a grim certainty in his voice. "It was my father's obsession. And mine." They found an old abandoned mine entrance, its timbers rotting a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain. The air that flowed out of it was cold and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and something else, something ancient and forgotten. "Give me the journals," Cassian said. He took them from her, his hand surprisingly gentle. "And the gun." Abigail hesitated for a moment before handing it to him. He was a different man now. The dreamer, the scholar, was gone, replaced by a hard, determined survivor. He used the butt of the pistol to smash the lock on his chains, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. With a final wrenching twist, he was free. He rubbed his bruised wrists, his eyes never leaving the dark entrance to the mine. "Stay close," he said, and plunged into the darkness. Abigail followed, her heart in her throat. The darkness inside the mine was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow the light and the sound. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the distance and the crunch of their boots on the gravelly floor. Cassian, however, moved with a surprising confidence, his hand trailing along the damp rock wall as he led them deeper into the earth. It was a terrifying, disorienting experience. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes opening into vast, silent caverns, sometimes narrowing into tight, claustrophobic passages. "How do you know where you're going?" Abigail whispered, her voice, a small, trembling sound in the immense darkness. "My father and I, we mapped these tunnels." Cassian said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the rock. He believed there was another vein of silver here, a mother lode that everyone else had missed. He spent years searching for it. They walked for what felt like hours, their world reduced to the feel of the rock under their fingers and the sound of their own breathing. Finally, Cassian stopped. "We'll rest here," he said. He had led them to a small, dry cavern, a side tunnel off the main shaft. He fumbled in his pockets and produced a small tin box. Inset were a few matches and a stub of a candle. He lit the candle, and the small, flickering flame pushed back the darkness, revealing their small sanctuary. In the candlelight, Abigail could see the toll the last few days had taken on Cassian. His face was a road map of pain and exhaustion, his eyes haunted. But there was a new hardness in them, a steely resolve she had not seen before. He opened the journals, his long fingers tracing the faded ink on the page. "It's all here," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of grief and wonder. His theories, his calculations, his maps. Cain didn't know what he had. He thought this was just about silver, but it's about so much more. "What do you mean?" Abigail asked, huddling closer to the small flame for warmth. "My father believed these mountains were unique," Cassian explained, his voice filled with a renewed passion. He believed they held a secret, a power that could change the world. He looked up at her, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that reminded her of the man she had first met. He was right, Abigail. He was right. He spent the next few hours poring over the journals, his face a mask of concentration. Abigail watched him, a silent guardian in the flickering candlelight. She saw the scholar in him re-emerge, the man who could read the secrets of the earth and the sky. As he read, he began to talk his words, filling the silence of the cavern. He spoke of geological formations, of fault lines, of underground rivers. He spoke of his father's dream of a new kind of energy, a power hidden deep within the earth. It was a story of science and faith, of a man's quest to unlock the secrets of the universe. And as she listened, Abigail began to understand. This was not just about revenge. It was about redemption. Not the false redemption of Cain's stolen wealth, but the true redemption of a man's legacy, a man's dream. Cain will never stop hunting us, Abigail said, her voice soft but firm. We can't hide in these tunnels forever. We won't have to. Cassian said, a strange, triumphant smile on his face. He pointed to a complex diagram in the journal. This is it. My father's grand design. It's a map, Abigail. A map to the heart of the mountain, and to the heart of Cain's operation. He explained his plan, his voice low and urgent. Cain's entire mining operation, his wealth, his power, was dependent on a single massive water pump that kept the lower levels of the mine from flooding. The pump was his strength, but it was also his weakness. My father found a way to divert the underground river, Cassian said, his finger tracing a line on the map. To redirect its flow, if we can get to the control valve, we can flood the entire mine. We can wash away Cain's empire in a single stroke. It was a bold, audacious plan, fraught with danger. But it was also a stroke of genius, a way to use Cain's own power against him. Can we do it? Abigail asked, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. We can. Cassian said, his gaze meeting hers across the small flame. But we have to do it together. In the flickering candlelight, deep in the belly of the earth, they were no longer just two fugitives running for their lives. They were partners, bound together by a shared purpose, a shared destiny. They had been to hell and back, but they had found each other in the darkness. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to break over the mountains. The hunt would be on. Cain's men would be swarming the mountainside, their guns ready. But Abigail and Cassian were no longer the prey. They were the architects of a storm, a flood that would cleanse the land of Jedediah Cain's corruption. The echoes of the past were all around them in the silent, waiting tunnels of the mine. But they were no longer listening to the past. They were writing the future, and it would be written in water and fire. The descent into the lower levels of the mine was a journey into the earth's guts. The air grew thick and heavy, the silence replaced by the rhythmic, deafening clang of the massive water pump, a mechanical heartbeat that pulsed through the very rock. The candlelight from their single dwindling candle cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes, turning rock formations into ghoulish watching figures. Cassian, guided by his father's meticulous maps, led the way with a grim, unwavering determination. The journals were tucked safely inside his shirt, a talisman against the encroaching darkness. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man on his home turf, but Abigail could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the constant, watchful scan of his eyes. They navigated a maze of tunnels, some so narrow They had to squeeze through sideways others, opening into vast, cathedral-like caverns, where their small light was swallowed by the immense darkness. They crossed rickety wooden bridges that spanned terrifyingly deep chasms, the roar of unseen water echoing from the depths below. It was a world of darkness, danger, and the deafening, relentless thunder of the pump. As they drew closer to the heart of the mine, they began to see signs of Cain's operation. Discarded tools, empty dynamite crates, and the faint, ghostly glow of distant lanterns. They could hear the shouts of the foreman and the clang of the miners' pickaxes against the rock. They were in the belly of the beast now, and the slightest mistake would mean discovery and certain death. They found the control valve in a small man-made chamber, a nexus of pipes and gears that looked like the entrails of some great iron beast. The valve itself was a massive iron wheel, rusted and formidable. It was guarded by two of Cain's men, who sat playing cards on a wooden crate, their rifles leaning against the wall beside them. Abigail and Cassian flattened themselves against the rock wall of the tunnel, the roar of the pump masking the sound of their ragged breathing. They were so close, yet the two guards were an insurmountable obstacle. They had only the one pistol with a few bullets left. A direct assault was suicide. "I'll create a diversion," Abigail whispered, her lips close to Cassian's ear. "Draw them away. You'll have to work fast." "No," Cassian hissed back, his grip tightening on her arm. "It's too dangerous. I won't lose you." "You won't," she said, her voice firm with a conviction she didn't entirely feel. "I'll be careful." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "It's the only way, Cassian. Trust me." He hesitated for a moment, his blue eyes searching hers in the dim light. He saw not fear, but a strength that mirrored his own. He gave a single reluctant nod. Abigail slipped away a shadow in the darkness. She crept down a side tunnel, her mind racing. She needed a distraction, something loud enough to be heard over the din of the pump, something that would draw the guards away from their post. She found what she was looking for in a small abandoned storage alcove. A pile of old rusty mining tools and a stack of empty metal barrels. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and then with all her strength, she pushed the barrels over. The crash was cataclysmic, a deafening cacophony of metal on rock that echoed through the tunnels like a thunderclap. "What was that?" one of the guards yelled, jumping to his feet. "Go check it out," the other one ordered, grabbing his rifle. As the two guards hurried down the tunnel towards the source of the noise, Abigail slipped back into the shadows, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had bought Cassian a few precious moments. She prayed it would be enough. Back in the control chamber, Cassian didn't waste a second. The moment the guards were gone, he sprang into action. He threw his entire weight against the massive iron wheel, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted with the effort. The wheel was stiff with rust and disuse. It didn't budge. He grunted a sound of frustration and desperation. He couldn't do it alone. He needed more leverage. He looked around frantically, and his eyes fell on a long iron pry bar leaning against the wall. He grabbed it and wedged it between the spokes of the wheel. He pushed his entire body, trembling with the strain. The wheel groaned in protest, a long, screeching sound of metal on metal. Then, with a sudden jarring lurch, it began to turn. At that moment, Abigail reappeared at the entrance to the chamber, her face pale with urgency. "They're coming back," she warned. "They knew it was a trick." Cassian didn't look up. He was in a battle with the iron beast, a primal struggle of man against machine. he gave one final desperate heave, and the wheel turned, the mechanism engaging with a deep, resonant thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. A new sound joined the chorus of the mine, a low, ominous rumble that grew steadily in volume, like the growl of a waking giant. The sound of the underground river diverted from its course, now surging towards the lower levels of the mine. "We have to go," Abigail screamed, pulling at his arm. But Cassian was not finished. He pulled his father's journals from his shirt and threw them into the complex machinery of the pump. The delicate pages were instantly caught in the gears, shredding them, choking the life out of the iron beast. It was a symbolic act, a final defiant gesture of redemption. He was not just destroying Cain's empire. He was setting his father's spirit free. The pump sputtered its rhythmic clangor, turning into a series of discordant, dying groans. Then, with a final, shuddering sigh, it fell silent. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise it replaced. It was an unnatural quiet, pregnant with the promise of the coming deluge. "Now we go," Cassian said, his voice grim. He grabbed Abigail's hand, and they ran. The rumble was a roar, now the sound of 1,000 tons of water surging through the tunnels below them. The ground began to tremble, and small rocks and dust rained down from the ceiling. They scrambled back the way they had come, their flight a desperate race against the rising tide. They could hear the shouts of the miners, their voices filled with panic and confusion. The flood was coming, a river of reckoning, to wash away the greed and corruption of Cain's world. They were nearing the surface when they saw him, Jedediah Cain, standing at the entrance to the mine, his face a mask of incandescent rage. With him were Flint and a handful of his most loyal men, their guns aimed at the dark opening of the tunnel. "There they are," Cain roared, his voice echoing in the tunnel. "Kill them! Kill them both!" A hail of bullets rained down on them, ricocheting off the rock walls with angry, whining sounds. Cassian and Abigail flattened themselves against the ground, the bullets flying over their heads. They were trapped. Behind them, the roar of the floodwaters was growing louder, closer. In front of them, a wall of armed men, determined to see them dead. "This is it, isn't it?" Abigail said, her voice surprisingly calm in the face of death. "Not yet," Cassian said, his eyes blazing with a fierce, defiant light. He looked at her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I never got to write your name in the stars, Abigail." "You did more than that, Cassian," she said, a small, sad smile on her lips. "You showed them to me." The ground gave a violent lurch, and a huge torrent of water burst from a side tunnel, sweeping away the flimsy wooden bridge they had crossed earlier. The flood was upon them. But it was not just a flood of water. It was a flood of justice. The water, channeled by the complex network of tunnels, was now a weapon. It surged through the mine, a powerful, unstoppable force, not just rising from below, but pouring down from above. A massive wave of water, black and churning with debris, erupted from the main shaft behind Cain and his men, catching them completely by surprise. They turned their faces a mixture of shock and terror as the wave crashed down on them. Cain screamed a high, thin sound of pure terror before he was swept away. His body tossed and broken like a child's toy. Flint and his men met the same fate, their guns and their cruelty no match for the raw elemental power of the water. The flood roared past Abigail and Cassian, a churning river of destruction that poured out of the mine and down the mountainside towards the town of Redemption. In the aftermath, there was a strange, eerie silence. The mine was dark, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and shattered dreams. But they were alive. They stumbled out of the mine into the pale light of a new day. They were bruised, battered, and covered in grime, but they were free. Below them they could see the town of Redemption, a scene of chaos and destruction as the floodwaters surged through its streets. Cain's empire, built on a foundation of lies and murder, had been washed away. They stood there for a long moment, two solitary figures on the mountainside, watching the end of an era. The past was a ghost drowned in the torrent of their making. The future was an unknown country, a blank page waiting to be written. "What now?" Abigail asked, her voice a whisper in the wind. Cassian looked at her, his blue eyes clear and bright in the morning light. The shadows of the past were gone, replaced by a steady, quiet strength. "Now," he said, taking her hand in his, "we find a new sky." He led her away from the ruins of Redemption, away from the echoes of the past. They didn't look back. They walked towards the rising sun, towards a future they would build together. A future written not in the stars, but in the quiet, steady beating of their own hearts. The desert waited vast and empty, but it was no longer a place of exile. It was a place of promise, a place where a man and a woman who had saved each other in the darkness could finally find their way home. The journey back to Arizona was a pilgrimage in reverse. They traveled not as fugitives, but as survivors. Two souls stripped bare by their ordeal and forged anew in its crucible. They acquired a pair of sturdy mules in a small, nameless town far from the ruins of Redemption, trading the last of Abigail's silver dollars and the story of a lost homestead. No one asked questions. In the West, the past was a private country, and most folks were too busy wrestling with their own to pry into the affairs of strangers. The land they traversed was no less harsh, the sun no less demanding. But something had changed. The vast empty spaces that had once seemed to mock Abigail's solitude now felt like a promise of peace. The silence was no longer a weight, but a canvas upon which they could paint a new life. They spoke little of what had happened in the mountains of Colorado. The memories were too raw, too sharp. Instead, they spoke of the future. Their words, tentative at first, like the first green shoots after a long winter. They spoke of rebuilding Abigail's homestead, of digging a deeper well, of planting a larger garden. They spoke of simple things, the small, quiet moments that constitute a life. Cassian was a changed man. The haunted, hunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet strength, a gentle confidence. The scholar and the survivor had merged, creating a man who was both dreamer and doer. He no longer looked at the sky with a sense of loss and longing, but with a quiet, appreciative wonder. Abigail, too, was transformed. The fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions had been burned away, leaving behind a flow of resilience she never knew she possessed. She had faced down her own demons and the demons of a man she had come to love, and she had emerged victorious. She was no longer just a homesteader. She was a warrior, a queen in her own small, dusty kingdom. When they finally crested the rise that overlooked her valley, Abigail's heart swelled with a feeling so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. The homestead. Her small, solitary sanctuary was still there, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. It was a symbol of her survival, a testament to the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. As they drew closer, they saw that something was different. A thin plume of smoke was rising from the chimney. A horse, not Bess, but a fine-looking sorrel was tied to the porch railing. A cold knot of fear tightened in Abigail's stomach. Had Cain's influence reached this far? Had some last vengeful remnant of his empire come to finish the job? Cassian put a hand on her arm, his face a grim protective mask. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "No," she said, her own resolve hardening. "We face this together." They approached the house cautiously, Cassian's hand on the pistol tucked into his belt. The front door creaked open, and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was an older man with a kind, weathered face and a shock of white hair. He was dressed in the simple homespun clothes of a farmer. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice a friendly, reassuring rumble. "The name's Elias Thorne. I'm your neighbor." Abigail and Cassian exchanged a look of stunned disbelief. "Neighbor," Abigail stammered. "My nearest neighbor is a day's ride from here." "Not anymore," Elias said with a warm smile. "My family and we just bought the old Miller place over in the next valley. We saw the homestead was empty, the animals untended. We were worried. We've been looking after things for you." Relief so profound and overwhelming it was almost dizzying washed over Abigail. She had been so consumed by her own battle that she had forgotten about the simple, everyday kindness of strangers, the very thing that had started this whole tangled affair. Elias's wife, a plump, motherly woman named Sarah, came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Abigail rose. She asked, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Elias, it's her. She's come home." That evening, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the small homestead was filled with the sound of laughter. The Thornes were good, decent people, their presence a balm to Abigail and Cassian's wounded souls. They shared a simple meal, and Abigail and Cassian told them a heavily edited version of their story, a tale of family trouble back east that had called them away unexpectedly. The Thornes, with the quiet wisdom of those who have seen their own share of hardship, did not press for details. Later, after the Thornes had returned to their own valley, promising to come back the next day to help with the repairs, Abigail and Cassian sat on the porch, the familiar creak of the rocking chair, a comforting domestic sound. The desert night was cool and clear, the sky a breathtaking tapestry of stars. "It's over," Abigail said, her voice a near whisper. "It's really over." "Yes," Cassian said, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "It is." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, their shoulders touching their presence, a silent affirmation of all they had endured and all they had found in each other. "I still feel guilty," Cassian said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "About my father. I spent so many years running from his legacy, from the pain of his death. I should have fought for him sooner." "You fought for him when it mattered," Abigail said softly. "You saved his dream from being corrupted. You gave him justice. And you did something more. You brought his work, his passion back to life. That's a legacy any father would be proud of." Cassian looked at her, his eyes shining in the starlight. "I couldn't have done it without you, Abigail. You saved me. In more ways than one." "We saved each other," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, his gaze lifted to the heavens. He was silent for a long moment, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. "You know," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "My father, he had another theory, a wild one. He believed that with the right equipment, with a powerful enough telescope, you could see the birth of new stars, not just the light from stars that had been born millions of years ago, but the actual real-time event." He turned to her, his blue eyes blazing with a familiar, passionate fire. He believed that the universe wasn't just a static, unchanging thing. He believed it was alive, constantly creating, constantly renewing itself. He walked back to her and knelt before her, taking both of her hands in his. "I was a fool, Abigail. I promised to write your name in the stars. But the stars don't need my help. They write their own stories. Stories of light and darkness, of death and rebirth." He looked up at the sky, at the river of light that flowed across the velvet blackness. "We're like them, you and I. We've been through the darkness. We've been broken, and we've been remade. We are a new constellation." He leaned in and kissed her a kiss that was not of desperation or loneliness, but of a deep, abiding love. It was a kiss of homecoming, of a future promised and a past redeemed. It was a kiss that sealed their story, not in the cold, distant light of the stars, but in the warm, beating heart of the world they would build together. The desert was no longer a place of exile, but a sanctuary. The silence was no longer a burden, but a song. And the sky with its infinite, blazing stars was not a reminder of what was lost, but a promise of all that was yet to be found. In a small homestead in the heart of the unforgiving West, two souls had found their own small corner of the universe, their own small piece of heaven. And that was a story more beautiful, more enduring than any ever written in the stars. The story of Abigail and Cassian reminds us that even in the harshest of landscapes, kindness can be the wellspring of incredible change and love the truest compass. Theirs was a destiny forged in dust and fire, a testament to the fact that our greatest strengths are often discovered in our darkest hours. They didn't just survive the West. They redefined it, proving that a shared future is the most valuable treasure of all. If their journey from a simple cup of water to a new life under the stars moved you, please give this video a thumbs up to let us know. Share it with someone who loves a story of courage and redemption. And for more tales from the heart of history, don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Thank you for watching.